For 800 years, the city of Rome was more than just a capital. It was the literal center of the universe, believed to be eternally invincible. But in the sweltering August of 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The gates were opened from within, and a barbarian army marched into the heart of the world. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake that signaled the end of an era and the death of a dream. The myth of the eternal city. Imagine living in a world where one name and only one name guaranteed order, safety, and the very concept of civilization. For nearly a millennium, Rome was not merely a city of stone and marble. It was a psychological fortress. To the citizens of the 5th century, the idea that Rome could fall was as physically impossible as the sun failing to rise in the east. They called it Roma Aeterna, eternal city. It was the heart of an empire that had stretched from the rain-swept moors of Britain to the burning sands of the Euphrates. But by 410 AD, that heart was beating with a frantic, irregular rhythm. How does a society react when its greatest strengths become its most fatal weaknesses? For centuries, Rome had absorbed its enemies, turning conquered tribes into loyal citizens and fierce warriors. But the cracks were widening, the borders were leaking, the treasury was draining, and the political elite in their villas remained cocooned in a delusion of grandeur, convinced that the prestige of the past would protect them from the realities of the present. They looked at their massive walls and their ancient titles and saw a shield that could never be pierced. But while the senators debated philosophy and prestige, the world outside those walls had changed. The barbarians were no longer just disorganized tribes looking for a fight. They were a displaced nation, led by a man who knew Rome's secrets because he had once served in its very own legions. We have to ask ourselves, is a civilization ever truly destroyed from the outside, or does it simply lose the will to sustain its own myth? As the shadows lengthened over the Roman Forum, the people ignored the distant sound of marching boots, believing that their history made them immortal. They were about to learn that history has no favorites, and that eternity is a much shorter time than they ever imagined. The barbarian at the gates, Alaric's long game. If the fall of Rome was a tragedy, its primary architect was a man who never actually wanted to destroy it. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, was not a wild-eyed savage looking to burn the world. He was a frustrated general who wanted a seat at the table. He was a product of Rome's own making, a Gothic leader who had fought for the empire, commanded Roman troops, and bled for the emperor. He didn't want to end the Roman way of life. He wanted to be a part of it. But what happens when an empire relies on the strength of outsiders while simultaneously treating them with bitter contempt? The story of Alaric is the story of a broken promise. The Visigoths had been pushed into Roman territory by the terrifying advance of the Huns, seeking nothing more than land to farm and protection under the Roman umbrella. Instead, they were met with systematic exploitation, starvation, and racism. Rome took their sons for its armies and gave them dog meat in exchange for their freedom. Can you imagine the resentment simmering in the hearts of these warriors? Alaric understood that Rome's greatest weapon was no longer its legions, but its reputation, and he was the one man who knew that reputation was a hollow shell. For years, Alaric played a sophisticated game of cat and mouse with the Western Emperor Honorius. He didn't march on Rome immediately. Instead, he negotiated, he withdrew, and he waited. He demanded gold, grain, and an official Roman generalship for himself, title that would legitimize his people within the imperial structure. But the emperor, hiding behind the marshes of Ravenna, was paralyzed by a lethal combination of incompetence and arrogance. He refused to pay, but lacked the power to fight. Every time Honorius broke a treaty, Alaric drew closer to the city walls. He wasn't just chasing a paycheck anymore. He was exposing a fundamental truth, that the masters of the world were now hostage to their own hubris. As the Visigoths descended the Italian peninsula, the question wasn't if they could reach Rome, but whether Rome would wake up before they arrived. The man at the gates didn't hate Rome. He simply knew exactly how much it was worth, and he was coming to collect. A city under siege, the hunger and the hubris. By the time Alaric's shadow fell across the Tiber for the third and final time, the eternal city was no longer a conqueror. It was a cage. We often imagine the fall of a civilization as a sudden explosion, but for the people inside Rome in 410 AD, the end of the world was a slow, agonizing grind. Alaric didn't need to storm the walls immediately. He understood a much simpler, more brutal mathematics. If you control the grain, you control the gods. By seizing the port of Ostia and the banks of the river, he cut the city off from its lifeblood. Rome, a metropolis of nearly 1 million people, was suddenly a stomach without a mouth. Have you ever considered how quickly the thin veneer of civilization peels away when the plates are empty? As the weeks turned into months, the grandeur of the marble forums was replaced by the stench of the dying. The grain doles stopped. The markets emptied. Reports from the time tell us that the city's inhabitants were reduced to eating leather, then vermin, and eventually, in the darkest corners of the city, resorting to cannibalism. This was the city that had dictated terms to kings, yet its citizens were now bartering heirlooms for a handful of flour. But even more striking than the hunger was the psychological paralysis of the Roman elite. Inside their secluded palaces, the Senate spent their time in heated, useless debates. They tried to buy Alaric off with massive amounts of gold, silver, and silkiven, stripping the statues of the ancient gods to pay the ransom. Alaric took the gold and stayed right where he was. When a Roman envoy tried to intimidate him by saying there were thousands of Romans ready to fight, the Goth famously replied, "The thicker the grass, the easier it is to mow." The Romans were relying on a prestige that no longer existed, playing by the rules of a world that Alaric had already rewritten. They were waiting for a miracle, for a hero, or for the emperor in Ravenna to send an army that didn't exist. They were so blinded by their own history that they could unsee the reality staring them in the face. The walls that had protected them for centuries were now merely the boundaries of their own graveyard. The midnight betrayal, when the gates swung open, on the night of August 24th, 410 AD, a silence fell over Rome that was more terrifying than any war cry. The siege had reached its breaking point, but the walls of the city, the massive brick-faced Aurelian fortifications, remained unbreached. They were an engineering marvel, designed to withstand the greatest armies on earth. To take Rome by force would have required a bloodbath that Alaric was not yet ready to pay for. He didn't need to break the walls, however, because he knew that a city is only as strong as the people holding the keys. Then, in the dead of night, the Salarian gate swung open. Historians have debated for centuries who pulled the bolt. Was it a group of starving slaves who believed that any master, even a Goth, was better than a slow death by Roman hunger? Or was it, as some whispers suggest, an act of misguided mercy by a noblewoman named Proba, who opened the gates to end the city's starvation by forcing a conclusion to the standoff? Whatever the motive, the result was the same. The unreachable sanctuary had been compromised, not by a catapult or a ram, but by a hand from within. Can you feel the sudden shift in the air that night? The terrifying realization for the Roman guards when they heard the rhythmic thud of thousands of boots hitting the pavement inside the city limits. For the first time in 800 years, an enemy was inside. This wasn't a battle. It was a puncture wound to the heart of the world. The gates didn't just let in an army. They let in the terrifying reality that the Roman peace was a lie. As the Visigoths poured through the Salarian gate under the moonlight, the narrative of the eternal city evaporated in an instant. The unthinkable was no longer a theory. It was walking down the street. The psychological shield that had protected Rome for centuries had finally shattered. And as the first torches were lit, the citizens realized that their walls had not been keeping the barbarians out. They had been trapping the Romans in 3 days of fire, the reality of the sack. The darkness of that August night was not shattered by the dawn, but by the orange glow of a city beginning to burn. For 3 days, the Visigoths were given the run of the city that had once claimed to own the world. But if you are picturing a scene of mindless, total annihilation, the reality is far more haunting. This wasn't the chaotic destruction of a mindless horde. It was a systematic, calculated stripping of Rome's soul. Alaric, a Christian himself, ordered his men to spare the great basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, turning them into islands of sanctuary amidst a sea of chaos. But outside those doors, the eternal city was being treated like a giant treasury. What does it feel like to watch the history of your ancestors being hauled away in the back of a wagon? The Goths moved from palace to palace, seizing the gold, the silver, and the precious tapestries that had been accumulated over centuries of conquest. They didn't just take the wealth, they took the people. Thousands of Roman citizens, from the poorest laborers to the daughters of senators, were rounded up to be sold into slavery or held for ransom. The very people who had looked down upon the barbarian as a subhuman species were now forced to kneel before them, begging for their lives in the shadows of their own crumbling monuments. The physical damage to the buildings was actually relatively limited compared to later sacks. Yet the fires at the Salustian palaces sent plumes of smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles. This smoke was a signal to the rest of the Mediterranean. The sun had set. The palace of the Caesars was ransacked, its imperial regalia tossed into Gothic sacks. But the true horror wasn't just the theft of gold. It was the violation of the Roman identity. The Goths were not just taking things, they were proving that the Roman gods and the Roman state were powerless to stop them. As you imagine the sound of marble statues being toppled and the screams echoing through the winding streets, ask yourself, if the heart of the world can be broken in just 72 hours, what does that say about the fragility of everything we build? By the third day, when Alaric finally ordered his troops to march out of the gates, he left behind a city that looked much the same, but was fundamentally hollowed out. Rome still stood, but the Roman world was gone. The psychological collapse, a world without a center. The fires in Rome eventually flickered out, but the shockwaves from the sack traveled faster than the smoke. In an age without the internet or instant communication, the news of Rome's fall moved like a physical blow across the Mediterranean. When the reports reached St. Jerome in his cave in Bethlehem, he was so paralyzed by grief that he claimed to have forgotten his own name. He wrote, "The whole world perished in one city." This was the psychological collapse. For centuries, even as the borders frayed, people believed that as long as Rome stood, the concept of Western civilization was safe. Now, that pillar was gone. What happens to the human psyche when the one thing you thought was permanent turns out to be fragile? For the pagans who remained in the city, the sack was a divine punishment for abandoning the old gods of Jupiter and Mars in favor of Christianity. They argued that Rome had been protected for 1,000 years by its ancient rites, and the moment those rites were silenced, the walls fell. This created such a cultural crisis that it forced St. Augustine to write The City of God, a monumental work of philosophy designed to answer a single desperate question. If the greatest Christian empire on earth can be humbled by barbarians, where is God? This wasn't just a religious debate. It was the birth of a new, darker worldview. The optimism of the classical age to belief in progress, law, and the triumph of the state was replaced by a sense of impending doom. People across the empire began to realize that the Roman peace had been a temporary gift, not a permanent right. If Rome wasn't eternal, then nothing was. The sack of 410 AD didn't just break buildings, it broke the collective confidence of the West. It taught a terrifying lesson that we still grapple with today, that the complexity of a civilization is no guarantee of its survival. As the survivors crawled out of the ruins to find their neighbors gone and their treasures stolen, they weren't just looking at a damaged city. They were looking at the beginning of a world where the center no longer held, the funeral of an empire. The most haunting thing about the sack of 410 AD is that, on paper, the Roman Empire didn't actually end that year. It would technically continue in the West for another 66 years, and in the East for another millennium. But the Rome that survived was a ghost. It was the funeral of an empire that refused to lie down. After Alaric marched his wagons of loot south, the city attempted to rebuild, but the magic was gone. The aura of invincibility, the soft power that had kept the provinces in line, had evaporated. Why pay taxes to a ghost? Why obey a law from a city that couldn't even protect its own gates? Think about the sheer scale of the desertion that followed. Without the centralized authority of Rome, the complex networks of trade and communication began to disintegrate. The lighthouse was smashed, and the ships were lost in the dark. In the decades following the sack, the provinces realized they were on their own. Britain was abandoned. Gaul was carved up by Germanic tribes. North Africa, the breadbasket of the empire, fell to the Vandals. The Roman state became a hollowed-out shell, a series of increasingly desperate emperors ruling over a shrinking map from the safety of a swamp in Ravenna. We often look for a single end date for history, but for 10 AD was the moment the soul left the body. The city remained, but the idea of Rome as the universal protector was dead. The empire had become a patchwork of local warlords and crumbling infrastructure. The great roads were no longer patrolled. The aqueducts began to leak and fail. The libraries fell into silence. The sack wasn't just a military event. It was the final, irreversible transition from the sunlight of the classical world into the long, uncertain twilight of the Middle Ages. Rome didn't fall because its walls were weak. It fell because the belief system that sustained it, the shared hallucination of Roman greatness, had been exposed as a fantasy. The echo of the ruins, why 410 still matters. We look back at the smoking ruins of 410 AD and see a distant tragedy, a relic of a world that bears no resemblance to our own. But is that true? History is not a straight line. It is a series of cycles, and the echoes of Rome's fall still resonate in the halls of modern power. The sack of Rome serves as the ultimate warning for any civilization that begins to believe its own myth of eternity. It reminds us that greatness is not a permanent status, but a fragile equilibrium that must be maintained through more than just wealth and walls. What happens when a society stops investing in its future and starts living off the fumes of its past? The Romans of the 5th century were obsessed with their own exceptionalism, even as their infrastructure crumbled and their political systems became paralyzed by tribalism and greed. They were a society that had forgotten how to integrate, how to adapt, and how to face uncomfortable truths. They assumed that because they had always been the center of the world, they always would be. Are we any different? Today, we rely on global systems, digital, financial, and logistical, that are far more complex and far more fragile than the grain ships of the Mediterranean. The lesson of 410 AD is that the end of the world doesn't usually happen with a bang, but with a series of small, ignored cracks that eventually meet. It's the story of a gate being opened from the inside. It's the realization that when the people lose faith in their institutions, the institutions have already fallen. The physical collapse is just a formality. As we look at the ruins of the Roman Forum today, we shouldn't just see stone, we should see a mirror. Rome reminds us that no empire is too big to fail, no city is truly eternal, and the only thing that survives the fire of history is the wisdom we choose to learn from it. The gates are always there, and the shadow of the Goth is never as far away as we think. The question is, if the silence fell tonight, would we be ready? The sack of Rome wasn't just the end of a city, it was the end of a certainty. It serves as a haunting reminder that the systems we take for granted, the stability of our currency, the safety of our streets, and the endurance of our culture, only as strong as our collective will to uphold them. History shows us that when a civilization stops looking forward and begins to rest on the laurels of its past, the countdown to its midnight has already begun. If you found this deep dive into the death of the eternal city thought-provoking, make sure to hit the like button. It helps the algorithm know that high-value historical storytelling still has a place on this platform. But before you go, I want to hear from you. Do you see parallels between the Rome of 410 AD and our modern world? Are we currently ignoring the cracks in the gates, or have we learned the lessons that the Romans missed? Let's start a conversation in the comments below. For more stories on the rise and fall of the world's greatest powers, subscribe and turn on the bell notification so you never miss a moment of history.